Um, Hello. So this video is it's a bit of a response to another video, good video, by a pair of American bloggers, I think, called Matt and David. They are the Left Reckoning, I think is their title. I'm not that well versed with them. I've only come across this video because of the subject was blockchain and Bitcoin. So I'm just going to use this video as kind of a response and to some of the criticisms they made in that video, and trying to shed a bit more light on things. Maybe I'll open up the discourse a bit, and also use it as a model for my own opinions on where this kind of technology is going to lead in terms of power and political power and political structures. So not, some of it will be technical and a lot of it's going to be more philosophical. And so we have to note that I'm a socialist ideologically, and so we're going to be looking at whether blockchains are socialist technology or capitalist technology. Okay. So first thing, I think I'll just run through a few of the basic points. So what's kind of key to add here is their video was about Bitcoin specifically, about kind of busting the myths of Bitcoin, and I do fundamentally agree with a lot of their points if we look at Bitcoin just as it is today, and we don't actually, if we start to look at where it could be in the future, or even if it could be superseded by other blockchains, I think a lot of the criticisms they level against it aren't reasonable to level if you look in that longer term. So first I'll just do with those before I get to the points where we're probably a lot closer. So the first point, I mean, they're using the situation in El Salvador as their kind of case study. But the first point is that it's too slow. Bitcoin itself is too slow. There's not enough transactions per second for it to function as a payment method. So that is totally true today. It's far too slow. It's like 7 transactions a second. Even with its Lightning network, it doesn't go up to a huge amount. But nobody is, I think, believing that this technology will stay there. I think a lot of the arguments actually center around this idea that this kind of Bitcoin maximalists, they call themselves, and they believe in this kind of monolithic one blockchain to rule them all kind of thing. And that might get a lot of noise in the media, but I don't think it's a position that many people hold really in the space. I mean, I don't know really, but I don't get the feeling, because if you look, there's so many blockchains coming up now, and there's a lot of them seeking to build on each other and join up and kind of come together. There's like layer 0, layer 1, layer 2 blockchains. There's still things to be developed in terms of sharding blockchains and lots of other kind of technical avenues. And so just to go on what some of those teams are predicting, they are predicting transactions per second in the millions, not the thousands or the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. So if you take that like it could happen, then the issue of transactions per second I don't think is relevant. The second one was the environmental impact of Bitcoin, and again that's true right now. Proof of work blockchains are environmentally destructive, and they used a lot of CPUs and tech like that, so that's having an impact on the market. So they're right there, but again, there's no new blockchains coming out that use proof of work, and all of them, I think, other than Bitcoin, the big ones, are moving towards proof of stake, and the other ones are coming out as proof of stake. And just very quickly on that, instead of doing a load of work, burning resources to prove that you are a good faith actor in a consensus network, you are staking value. And fundamentally, you just don't use the same electricity. We'll come on to staking and things like that later in terms of their political relevance. But the environmental question here actually is not, I think, if blockchains per se are environmentally destructive. It's more the things they will replace actually are more environmentally destructive. So I think once you've got a 1 million transaction per second network set up, you no longer need the physical infrastructure that comes with a centralized system like Visa. So you don't need the buildings and the humans who have to commute to the buildings and keep those buildings warm, and it's everything that filters along the whole banking sector. So to look just at a kind of electricity per transaction isn't the right way to equate the real impact. So I think that argument falls down if we really project where this technology is going and not just look at the situation in El Salvador. The third one that was coming up a lot in the video was speculation. And again, it's true, you can't have a payment network if the unit of exchange doesn't have a stable price. It just simply doesn't work. And they're quite right to point that out. But the question there will again be, can Bitcoin or whatever replaces it find a balance, find its value? And I would say that really everything right now that comes out in a capitalist economy is subject to speculation. And it's subject to speculation until it achieves what it's going to achieve, until that piece of technology is actually fully running, fully operational, and is then integrated into society. The value of it cannot be estimated by the market. And like it or not, right now that's how things are valued. There isn't a global communist government that can put values on things. There is global markets. So everything is subject to speculation. Of course, there is the reality that digital currencies are more prone because they're digital. They are they're digital, and what was the other one? They are generally unregulated. So you can set up these exchanges which basically utilize the kind of the speed of digital technology and the fact that there's very little regulation to create quite a Wild West speculative market. And those price swings are being driven at the moment by speculators. But that doesn't mean that it can't find a place eventually. It can't stabilize. And then that would be the point where it starts to be more useful as a currency. And so we bring that back to El Salvador, and what El Salvador is doing, the president of it is a gamble. He's basically gambling with the El Salvadorian economy and a lot of those people's potential savings and things like that. And I guess he's hoping that he can ride it out for 2-3 years, or whatever it takes, and then the reality will be that he's actually sat on a huge amount of wealth. Risky, but old strategy. Okay. So those are the 3 general points which came up a lot, and I felt they had relevance to the immediate situation, but I think would fall away from relevance as time goes by. And now I think we'll come to the main issue, and where I am in much more agreement, and that is monetary policy. And it's entirely true. Right now, any country with a central bank has command over its monetary policy. It can print more of its currency. I think also it can destroy its currency. It can do other things, all related to whether it wants to be an export economy, an import economy, or it needs to respond like to this pandemic or something like that. And that's a powerful thing to have. And I'm in agreement. No country that really has that kind of strong central currency is going to give that up, and they won't see it replaced with a cryptocurrency. And I think this is where we also come to a little bit of a fallacy in the argument that people are suggesting that Bitcoin will become fiat currency and will replace all fiat currencies. I think maybe that was the start and the dream in the white paper, but I don't think anyone who has an understanding of these systems and politics really believes that that is the future of even Bitcoin. I think I think if we look at Bitcoin or potentially what might replace it, it is not angling to become a fiat currency. It's angling to become a universal store of value, like gold. That's why it's mentioned as gold. It wants to be a universal store of value, a payment system, say to remove Visa, something like that. And in combination with the smart contracts and decentralized finance and those elements of blockchain technology, it is aiming to replace things like the SWIFT system, so the international payment system, settlement system, and it potentially going to remove large chunks of the banking sector, like credit, loans, and even mortgages, and some of these things. So if you accept that the argument is that Bitcoin will become the fiat currency eventually, the single currency of the globe, then I'm in agreement. It's not going to happen, certainly not within several lifetimes. So but I think it's a bit of a straw man. I don't know how many people are even arguing that anymore. So I'd rather look at this idea that it will become the universal store of currency. And here we can return back to El Salvador. So is it just a reckless gamble and hoping to speculate on the value of this currency in the future? I don't think it's just that. So the argument goes that if you accept Bitcoin, you will no longer have monetary policy. You'll no have control over your currency. But if you look at El Salvador, they don't have their own currency. So they're using Bitcoin to replace the US dollar, aren't they? They're not using it to replace an internal currency. And there's a lot of countries around the world, I think 7 or 8, Ecuador, something like this, that directly use the US dollar. So they might have an interest in this, to have detachment from the Federal Reserve of America. But more importantly, and this is on a global scale, every country can pay its debts in dollars, and most of them have to pay their debts in dollars. The international global reserve currency is the dollar. Now, that is a foundation of American imperialism. It gives America huge leverage on countries, and unfortunately, even if America was to have a socialist revolution, their Federal Reserve would still print their money in accordance to their economic situation. They wouldn't be printing it in accordance to everyone's economic situation in the world. Nor would they open up the kind of democratic structures that control their bank to all the other countries in the world. So, I think there's definitely a strong argument for having a universal store value that isn't attached to any country, superpower or otherwise. And I think this is the gamble that El Salvador is going for. It's trying to break free of US financial hegemony. And as a socialist, I support that. Let's see. Yes. And also I think there is an argument for having potentially returning to some kind of gold standard, because in the video of Matt and David, they seemed very keen on this kind of very modern monetary theory whereby you can just keep printing money as much as you like. Crisis after crisis, you just print more money. And we've had two major ones now, the financial crash 2008 and the pandemic. And can the logic of this system actually sustain itself, this kind of endless money supply? And we might be coming to the answer to that in the next 5 years, whether in fact now our economies just shatter, because fundamentally what that monetary philosophy is handing a debt to your children and then handing a debt to their children, and maybe one day someone has to pay that. So, it could be an argument now is maybe a good time to step away from this kind of endless printing of money and return to some kind of gold standard. Without, obviously, we can't return to the gold, because gold is monopolized, and there's very limited places in the world it can still be mined, and it's actually a rubbish transaction system, isn't it? It's very heavy and such like. So if you're going to look for a universal store of value, then I think the blockchain technology is pretty good. It's set up well for that. So, and now I think we can get into the real nitty-gritty of politics and power and monopolies, and we can see, is it capitalist, is it socialist, and what do those things really mean? So I think we can say at the moment that the system we do have has been monopolized by capitalists. I think the 2008 crisis was a direct example of that, because the private banks created mountains of very complicated debt structures and derivatives and all this, and there was effectively no regulation, and it went tits up, and the public sector printed loads of money and filled the banks with it. So clearly private interests have captured the state and the regulators. Now, first let's say, and ignore blockchain, and say, can socialists really undo that? Can you write regulation that is unbreakable? And sometimes I think here the left's position sometimes is almost as if it requires there to be at least some human actors who are infallible. And I think that is an illusion. I think we're going to have to accept fallibility into our human condition. So yeah, and I'm very open on debate on all of this, and looking for the future, and yeah, can you create political systems that can really regulate these kind of financial institutions? And here is the main point really. The danger that is perceived of in the blockchain situation is private money being monopolized. But we've already seen that the state money can be monopolized. So what's the common theme here? The common theme is the monopoly capitalist, isn't it? So I think if a socialist revolution can't fundamentally deal with the entity of a capitalist who can have unlimited accumulation of wealth and ownership of wealth, then they cannot secure, with no matter how much regulation or political systems they put in, they won't be able to secure it, because eventually over time that capitalist will buy them out. And I think this is the general Marxist argument. So really, if we feel that we can destroy the actual existence of these kind of monolithic capitalists, then if we can do that, isn't the argument as well for the blockchain also now not relevant? So if we can destroy the uber large capitalists, then they aren't there to monopolize the blockchain either. So it feels to me that potentially the fight here is not, the fight is the same in both systems. You need some kind of way of actually dealing with these large predatory capitalists. Now, it might be that a blockchain system lets them run riot and doesn't help you at all in regulating them and such like. But I'm now going to look at the blockchain in this sense. Can it help a more socialist kind of achieve, more socialist future? And I'm just going to skim on that thing that I think it can at least stop what happened in the 2008 crisis. So there you've got private banks doing what they want, and you could say that they could increase the regulation on them or such like that. But fundamentally, if you had a decentralized system, then potentially what you could be doing there is setting up a system that simply cannot create the amount of debt and the kind of debt that can then crash, because these systems will be peer-to-peer, or they'll have algorithms within them that simply don't allow the kind of reserves in them to exceed their their, what you call it, your kind of your position, your debt position or whatever it's called, your liabilities or what have you. So here as well, I'm not too sure whether these things are possible, but I'm keeping an open mind whether this whole swathe of the banking sector can just be replaced. And if you look at that, really, what the difference here is in one system, which is either the present capitalist one or a kind of ideal socialist one, at every point of the system you have a human actor who is effectively trusted, either the political actor trusted to represent you, or the regulator trusted to enact the laws, or even the banks, the bankers trusted to follow the laws. And at each stage you have these human actors, human fallible actors. And maybe you could produce a really strong legal framework that will stand the test of centuries. I don't think you could if you still allow mass accumulation of wealth. So again, but that's an earlier point. But I think if you look at the blockchain, what that technology is trying to do is try to remove the fallible, try to remove the human. And obviously, this is where it's going to really be key later on. You need a human to stake the value for it to run. So there is a human element here, and that's the element that really is important, I think, in this discussion. But the rest of it is very much a kind of marriage of maths, computer science, and behavioral science. And instead of trying to create infallible human systems, they're trying to create a kind of infallible logic, a system based on logic and human game theory. I'm not a big fan of game theory, but it's about that notion of incentives and threats and stuff, combined with encryption and fancy computer architecture. So let's say you have a system, and like Bitcoin, and it becomes a universal store of value, and countries that have always had strong central banks are still using their central banks because they appreciate the kind of power that gives them, and most of the other rest of the countries in the world who don't, who aren't superpowers or ex-empires like Britain, they're like, okay, well, we're not so keen on having our own currency, but however. Of course, the danger is an actor could still co-opt this universal globalized currency. And so you could still run into danger there, especially the countries that have given up their central bank status. Now, the important thing is to see, like, how is that? What's the reality of this situation? Because everyone just says, because you can, fundamentally stake. Anyone can stake, and all you need is capital. Then it lends itself to monopoly and monopoly control. But that's very easy to say that in a kind of very abstract vacuum kind of way. But how does that play out in the world? And I think this is where you see that maybe it isn't quite as easy as it sounds. and even to do it wouldn't achieve the things that the monopolist capitalists set out to achieve. So, yeah. So how would they go about it? Let's say it's not Bitcoin, it's the Ethereum network, and I'm going to just make up a few figures here, but they're going to be ballpark figures, and you just have to play around with them in your head and see which figures would be needed for this to work. But basically, you've got a situation now where so we're going to have to relate it to Bitcoin in a way, because then I've got figure 4. But so to control basically the monetary policy of a decentralized blockchain, you need to control 51%. You need a consensus. You need to be in the consensus, so then you can control it. And it's put down that right now the Bitcoin network to get that kind of consensus, it costs about $14 billion. Now, the Bitcoin network, as was accepted, isn't even running really now. No one's using it. It's a little bit of wealth from speculation and stuff, and it still costs $15 billion to get the 41%, 51%. So if we extrapolate that, that being roughly a good figure, and we could potentially extrapolate it onto a staking system with Ethereum and everything, but then look at a situation where even one major economy was accepting this in some form, and it was being used in some form on that kind of scale, then already you're way above the $14 billion mark. But let's say still, all you need is, say, $20 billion to really seize 51% of this network. You now have to look at who has the incentive for this, because if the states don't feel it's a threat because they can either still print their fiat currency, or they actually see it as a benefit because it's no longer living under the yoke of imperial hegemony, then they aren't probably going to be that interested in seizing control of it for their own ends. And it's more potentially these individual capitalists, these individual actors, maybe groups of them. But then you've got to look at how many of these capitalists actually have $20 billion in liquid assets. Because you don't want just wealth. You're talking about getting $20 billion of Ethereum. So, so if you take Bezos, he's got $200 billion of assets. But if he starts to liquidate those to get hold of them into cash to then buy the Ethereum, the share prices of Amazon are going to start to tumble. Especially those kind of figures are going to start to tumble. So he's going to lose more than 20 billion in the short run, getting that 20 billion out. And then he's going to go buy some Ethereum. And as he does it, because he's buying Ethereum, that causes the price to go up. So he's going to spend more than 20 billion to get 20 billion's worth of Ethereum. So that's where you see a kind of disparity in the actual reality of bringing that wealth to bear to achieve your aims. Also, it could easily be regulated that you start to have laws around like staking pools needing to have identities and stuff, and obviously there could be a cat and mouse system, because in the end the state can't really come down on this. It can't really regulate it that strongly, but maybe there is ways about regulating the staking pools to a degree, and in a way it's that if you don't feel like you can regulate the capitalists, that really the capitalists will take a global kind of regulation system. So there is potentially a regulation system that can at least catch enough of this so people can't just sneak up with $20 billion all of a sudden. But then even let's imagine they did, and they started to control the monetary policy of Ethereum. Now, if they did this in a drastic way, like totally changing the transactions, then Ethereum becomes worth nothing. Money floods out of it as fast as it can, and it crashes. And so, if that was Bezos's aim, well done. You've spent close to $40 billion to destroy something. What has he gained? And this is the important thing here. Is like, people don't just go out to take things down. They're working through an incentive. And there is no clear incentive there, especially because if Ethereum goes down, then Cardano is ready to take its place, or one of the others, or by this time you've probably got an extremely broad ecosystem, and maybe it's not actually that easy to just take the whole thing down through this 51% attack. Maybe you can take a chunk of it down, you lose your $40 billion, and you're going to have to get another 40 to take the next chunk down. And so it becomes a kind of a war whereby you have to ask what the person is gaining from waging the war. Because also, most capitalists, they're going to want this fast, feeless mechanism of exchange that facilitates their activities. So seeking to destroy it maybe is not what they really want. So maybe you could also co-opt it and just start to fiddle with it, fiddle with the the algorithms. So you just get a little bit more money, But the way the algorithms in Ethereum work is the more that is staked, the less the stakers get. So if someone's taken $40 billion and chucked it in, they're probably going to be getting a horrendous return. And if they really start to chunk up the return on it, and then people will be like, someone's manipulating it, let's all leave. Or I think there's strategies around ways to deal with these attacks. And you'd have to look more into the technical side of it. But fundamentally, they're not going to be getting, business isn't going to be getting a return on that $40 billion. It's just not. And so again, where's the incentive? He should have just left it in Amazon, and he'd be getting a lot more money. But again, let's imagine that there are cabals of capitalists, maybe from the old banking sector, got a grudge to bear, or something like that, and they want to take it down. In which case, then potentially all it needs is one socialist state, or any state that still has a central bank operating, but still sees the value in this global universal store of value, and doesn't want to return to the hegemony of the US. Now, $40 billion is a lot to an individual, or even a couple of individuals, but a really combative nation state can print $40 billion and buy Ethereum with it. And of course, this is not going to be good for their inflation rates, and it will devalue their currency. But in the end, they will have bought $40 billion worth of something. They will have value for their expenditure. And then maybe you can look at it this way. What if the future is more like this? That you accept that there might be these kind of actors that are willing to attack this system, but as long as there are enough democratic states willing to support it, could they really ever overpower it? Could they ever really get 51%? So maybe it's a kind of a lack of an imagination here to think that this network will just be full of individuals and states won't start to get involved. Mm-hmm. I mean, even El Salvador now must have large resources of Bitcoin. So yeah, that's where I think it becomes a bit more interesting, and it's it isn't so clear cut whether you really could get 51% of a network. And also, I think if really it became a truly global network, then there's just no way, because basically what you're talking about there is the monetary supply of the globe, and you needing to get 51% of it. Not even America has 51% of the monetary supply of the globe. So obviously that is like way down the line. That's the maximalist position, that all the currencies eventually get absorbed into it. But if that does happen, then I don't think there is individuals that can attack that. And again, you're just probably coming back to a system where if individuals can attack that, then their power is beyond simple monetary policy manipulation. Really is. They would have used that power to have brought up whatever political system you have in place to regulate your monetary policy anyway. And they'd be using most of it for much more revenue generating investments. So yeah, I'm interested in a social point of view about whether this kind of technology is beneficial, because it's creating systems without third parties that can be bought and corrupted. It's creating systems brought out of logic and human behavioral game theory and stuff. And maybe actually that is what we need to form global commons and these kind of larger socialist structures. I mean, I don't know if that is right or wrong. Actually, I just think it's an interesting thing to look at, and sometimes I think this is a criticism of the left that it lacks imagination, and is sometimes hanging on to an idea of humanity which very rarely shows itself. Yeah. I mean, is there ways to construct blockchain technology which has even more things hardwired into it? That even if there is, once it's launched, even if there is a 51% attack, there's certain fundamentals that cannot change. Maybe they could only change if there were another kind of democratic voting system where every citizen in the world has one vote, and that's the only way you could change this kind of global monolith. So I think there's lots of rooms to play around this technology, and I think just focusing on Bitcoin, and especially Bitcoin as it exists today, is very reactionary, very typical of leftist analysis, I think, actually. And really, as well, the technology, I think it's critical to show that it probably isn't there to replace the fiat currencies of strong central banks. It's there to replace the US dollar as the global currency reserve. And then, if it can achieve that, see where it goes from there. And, it's there to remove the physical human infrastructure of the banking sector, which is rife with corruption and needs replacing, if you ask me. But well, that was quite long, wasn't it? If I figure out how to timestamp stuff, I'll try and do that. Well, no point telling you now, is there? Anyway, I'm really open to hearing people's thoughts about this and whether I'm all wrong and got the whole technology wrong, and and I do realise there's dangers. Unregulated capital getting hold of this kind of technology, and they are having a field day. They're having a big party at everyone else's expense, just like they've been doing for the last 200 years. So. Great. Anyway, cheers.